Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, very clear.
Terrific. All right. So for being here, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, perhaps, to our global audience. It really is wonderful to speak to you. I am just going to share my screens. So I will just move forward and talk to you about a particular teacher. So let me just start with sort of echoing Dr. Boynton's beginning that we all know, in fact, it's become almost cliche to talk about the rapidly changing world that we live in. And in fact, my talk is beginning like many talks do, to sort of focus on technology and to focus on the stressors of today's society and what have you. But I'm starting to feel as though it's not just a rapidly changing world, but a rapidly deteriorating world that we seem to be witnessing that is becoming very distressing for all of us. So we share many, many global worries. And in fact, there seems to be so much catastrophe, conflict, and cruelty that we're witnessing. So little evidence, it seems, of caring or compassion or community that sometimes it is very easy to feel sort of desperate, to despair, to be overwhelmed by information, to suffer sort of disaster fatigue. And in some ways, it's almost as if we've become a bit immune to all this worry and trouble that all of us are facing around the world, whether it's climate change, tremendous poverty, social unrest, and of course, too much conflict. But just when we thought that things couldn't get any worse, in the last 5 years, we've experienced some new challenges. So first of all, this idea of fake news. Before 2015 or 2016, I don't think that we talked about fake news at all. So it's hard now to know what is true, what is honest, what has fidelity, what to pay attention to. In addition, for those of us as educators, PISA has become almost a driver of what we do in schools and in education. And so this global competitiveness has really taken over and then caused us to be in competition with one another, but also to focus on the wrong things, I think, in terms of educating our children. Leaving lots and lots of societies feeling as though they're not good enough because they are not sort of meeting the metrics established by PISA and by OECD. We're seeing very, very troubling nationalism movements. And this is a picture from my hometown, Singapore, where there has been, unfortunately, some conversation about protecting Singapore for Singaporeans and being a little more exclusive in terms of outsiders who have always enjoyed a home in Singapore. And as you can see in the background, the sort of growing economic challenges, conflicts, trade wars, etc. And now, with what is happening today, the COVID pandemic has increased our economic worries, placed many people into further sort of home and food insecurity. It seems as though just yesterday we were enjoying travel, conversations with our friends, going out to dinner, going to work, doing sort of normal everyday things that we took for granted. And all of a sudden, that changed. In addition to that pandemic, there has also been the pandemic of racism. And Dr. Boynton talked about that as well. We have seen a spike. We talk about spikes in the COVID pandemic. We have seen, or in COVID infections, we have seen a spike in the racism infections. And we have witnessed and continue to witness the murder in the US of unarmed Black US citizens by the state. And some of those, only a few of the names I will say tonight, but we know that we need to speak the names of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Trayford Pellerin and Jacob Blake, who fortunately is still with us, but still to be shot 7 times in the back at close range. What kind of justice are we talking about? Fortunately, millions joined in solidarity around the world to speak the names of those who have experienced such injustice and have sort of come together to stand against racism. But this is another very real issue, and it's not just a US issue. There's conflict and racism and hatred and oppression everywhere in the world, including in our own backyards, in small ways as well as large ones. In addition to that, this year has been a year of unprecedented global mobility. In 2020, 1% of the world's population has experienced forced displacement. And that amounts to nearly 80 million people. And 40% of those people are children. So, and children need to go to school or should be in school. So the impact of this movement, this unprecedented movement, is really being felt by schools and educators. And in addition, millions of people are stateless. They are denied basic rights around nationality and citizenship, and a voice in society and in the participation of government. Cut off from just basic services and supports. What this has resulted is that these stark inequities that have always been with us have really been laid bare. We have not been able to turn our gaze away from the tragedy, from the sadness, from the oppression, from the marginalization, from the racism that many people around the world are experiencing, particularly children. And these are children that I call throwaway kids, in the sense that they have been the children considered deficient, considered unworthy, considered broken, children who have not been seen as worthy of good services, good education, and good supports. But I have to say that even in the middle of tragedy, there are some benefits. And so one benefit is that all of these pandemics, both the racism pandemic as well as the COVID pandemic, as well as refugee crises, have caused us to stop for a minute, have caused us to allow the noise and the frenzy to recede into the background, have caused us to flatten our own curves so that we're able to actually see each other and refocus on what really matters. Most important of all, I think COVID has illuminated the importance of schools and teachers. I don't think people are saying anymore that anybody can teach. I know that parents have discovered very, very quickly that it is actually very difficult to teach, even your own children. That learning is best supported by teachers of the human kind. So the conversations about AI taking over teachers and whether or not teachers are obsolete, I think those conversations are receding because what teachers can do cannot be done by machines. In addition to that, it is clear that we need social justice teachers more than ever before. We need teachers who can provide safe haven. We need teachers who can nurture students. We need teachers who are able to engage in these complex conversations, particularly at this time with young people, no matter what their age. And so my story tonight is to talk a little bit about one particular teacher. I'd like to introduce you to her because, because no matter what happens, no matter how dire situations seem, no matter how many conversations we have about whether teachers are good enough, what quality teachers ought to be, how bad schools are, etc., we always know that there are teachers who somehow do an amazing job and somehow do what we say the best teachers ought to. So this is my friend Rebecca Stanton, and Rebecca is a master teacher in New York City. She and I have worked together for several years now. Let me just kind of introduce you to her in one aspect. Rebecca is a mentor teacher for the TRTC program at Teachers College, Columbia University, a program that I started in 2009, and I'm happy to say continues so many years, over 10 years later, to continue to be a robust program. In fact, TRTC is in its third iteration with federal funding. I welcome you to go on the website so you can learn more about the program. But the short version is that residency programs simultaneously immerse teachers in preparation in schools, so they're in schools full time, at the same time that they are engaged in rigorous academic study. So it's both an academic program with lots of intellectual engagement and theoretical knowledge, as well as a highly practical program because residents are working face-to-face and hand-to-hand with teachers and students every single day. TRTC, like all the residency programs supported by the federal government in the US, works only with high-need schools. And high need typically translates into high poverty, and in New York City, majority minority schools. So Rebecca is one of our mentor teachers and one of our great partners with the TRTC program. And even though I'm at the University of Hong Kong, I continue to be connected to the program and continue to be very proud of it. So Rebecca and I were talking one day, and I said, you know, Rebecca, you are such a great teacher, and I want to study what you do, because you do amazing things with those throwaway kids that most people say aren't good enough, aren't smart enough, aren't capable enough to achieve the amazing things that you achieve. And she, of course, being Rebecca, was very, very enthusiastic about participating in this study with me. And we decided to be sort of co-researchers. And she said, I only have one question. And my question is, I know what I do works, but I want to know why. That's the only question I have. How can I talk about this in ways that explain this work? So that's what we set about doing. It's a qualitative study. We engaged in dialogic interviews that lasted about an hour long. They were conversational, so we talked back and forth, engaged us in reflexive introspection, where we sort of examined and analyzed and asked questions of her practice and our experiences together. And it engaged Rebecca in autoethnographic storytelling, because the interviews began with her own history and then moved, of course, into the work that she does with her students. It also involved classroom observations. Of course, at the time I was still at TC, and her school was a participant, partner with the TRTC program. And so we were in the school quite often, and I was lucky enough to be able to spend time in Rebecca's classroom. Other data included artifacts such as student work, photographs, videos, curriculum materials, and plans, and so on. And we had, in between the interviews, lots of sort of recursive conversations, and what I call interactive data analysis. So we would talk back and forth by email. Rebecca would say, she'd write me an email and say, oh, I've got this video I want to share you. Or look at these things that my students did. Or she would think of something in the middle of the night and send me an email with some additional data. So there was sort of data collection that occurred over the space of about 3 months intensely, and then we had a final interview actually just recently, which I will talk about a little bit later. So let me share with you some background about Rebecca. I said that she's a master teacher, and that no one, I think, would question that at all. It says 20 years, but she's actually been 20 plus years working with immigrant youth and their communities. And so in the middle of this intensive global migration, she is working with young people who are coming to New York City, a destination city and also state in the US, continues to be, despite the changes in immigration policy and laws. And these youth come with a variety of different experiences. I'll skip to the middle, she always works with the newcomers. So they're the brand new students, and they enter the classroom at all different times of the year because immigration, refugee status, migration occurs not on a schedule. It occurs when it occurs. At the time of the study, she had 19 students, aged 14 to 17. The majority of them were from the Dominican Republic and spoke Spanish as a dominant language, but she also had students from Ecuador, Mexico, and Yemen. Rebecca is both certified as an English language arts teacher as well as an English as a second language teacher. And currently she's actually back in school again to get her reading specialist license because she discovered that she was seeing sort of intersectionalities of needs with English language learners coming also with learning disabilities. And there's no reading specialist in the school, and so she decided that the best thing to do was for her, obviously, to go back and get this qualification. She works at CHA, which stands for Community Health Academy of Heights, and the Heights is Washington Heights, which is largely a Dominican Republic enclave. And as I said, New York City, high need, i.e. it's actually one of the poorest districts in New York City, and the school is particularly one that welcomes newcomers. So the interesting thing about Rebecca, and here's why I really wanted to kind of understand her practice, is that her students, newcomers, high poverty, coming from really challenging backgrounds and circumstances, consistently perform above the norm, not just for newcomers and English language learners, but as compared to native language speakers as well. What is important to say also is that her students achieve higher in a variety of ways. So in terms of expected levels of growth in English proficiency, they achieve more in the year that they spend with Rebecca than they do with other teachers. And in several cases, they pass the Regents English exam. That is a high school leaving exam for New York City students. Not all students take it. And in fact, the competency assessment for English is sometimes difficult for native English speakers to pass. But what is important to say here is that it's not just about tests, and it's not just about sort of the more typical metrics that indicate, success for students, but her students are engaged, sort of actively as activists. They participate as, in inquiry groups, engage in deep dialogue, do authentic writing, and also perform publicly in terms of sort of presenting their work to authentic audiences. So if you're not a Star Trek fan, you should be. But I use this slide to talk about sort of all of us come from a place that is far away from where we are now. But those faraway places plant seeds in us that help us to become the people we are today. And sometimes those seeds are good ones, and sometimes those seeds are not. But in the case of Rebecca, I'd like to talk a little bit about the critical antecedents to her development as a social justice teacher. So there are two that particularly stand out in her story. The first was that she was introduced very early on as an undergraduate to the writings of Paulo Freire, particularly, of course, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And that profoundly affected how she thought about people, immigrants, marginalized individuals, how she really thought about sort of society. The second was that she spent a great deal of time living among people from Nicaragua and El Salvador. She is also a fluent speaker of Spanish, and so she found herself being invited into their communities. So for teacher educators, there are two lessons here. One is that there is value in early experiences that can have a huge impact on young teachers. So our curriculum can matter. And in fact, this idea of community-based experiences and immersion experiences can be sort of profoundly sort of affecting on a long-term basis, as it was in the case for Rebecca. So many programs do this as part of pre-service teacher preparation, which is to engage pre-service teachers in diverse communities as part of their preparation. However, and this is a big however, it's not simply about exposure, and it's not simply about an occasional sort of hop in to a different community. But in Rebecca's case, it was deep immersion, not learning about a community, but becoming of a community, becoming part of a community, a contributing and valued insider. And so this notion of intimate relationships and the sharing of real lives, those are essential to empathetic and authentic knowing of other. So I think there's a very important lesson here for us as teacher educators when we think about how we expand the worldview of our students, that part of what we need to think about is the depth and extent of that experience, and how connections are more than kind of a semester-long sojourn, so to speak. So, I'm losing track here a little bit, sorry. Just want to make sure, all right. So in thinking about Rebecca's practice, I want to sort of talk about the theory behind it first, and then as part of that discussion to talk a little bit about what she does with her students, and then to close up with some broad principles around equitable mindsets, empowering pedagogies, and what it really means to love students, all students. So any of you who know Paulo Freire's work, if you don't, I certainly would recommend his work to you. But Paulo Freire always says that there's no such thing as a neutral education. That So, you know, sometimes educators say, well, I don't want to be political, or education isn't political. But actually, education is probably the, the first step in a political process. And that teachers are engaged in political work no matter what they do. That even non-action is a political action. And so Paulo Freire talks about if education is not neutral, then what educators need to be engaged in is the practice of freedom. Because if you're not engaged in the practice of freedom, then all you're doing is helping to perpetuate what is the status quo. And that if your students, in his case men and women whom he was dealing with, but if your students don't learn to engage critically with reality and learn how to be part of it, they are then not able to transform their world. So in Rebecca's case, and this is a quote from her, she says, I want my students to know that they can act as students, journalists, historians, or activists in this world and in their communities. Their ideas matter, and they need to learn how to express their ideas in powerful ways. So she begins the process of engaging her students with a fundamental understanding and assumption. She expects her students to be conscious of the world around them, to be thinking about how they fit in with that world. And that her job is not to wake them up. They're already awake. Her job is to provide outlets for their important ideas and perspectives. So no banking approach, no blank slate. They come with lots of things to think about. And she, in this situation, works to help them develop the language to express their ideas. So she says, I'm teaching them a new language, and I'm mostly teaching them the dialect of academic English that is associated with power. But she understands that it's a very delicate dance because she says, this is not about, you know, one style of discourse being more important than another, but to enable my students to engage in multiple ways of engaging, talking, discourse styles, so that they are able to communicate their powerful ideas no matter where they are or who they're talking to. The other thing that Rebecca talks about is, you know, she says now, 20 years later, after I've been to school, graduate school, and what have you, I have the language of critical pedagogy to kind of frame my ideas. But 20 years ago, when I was first introduced to these ideas, I didn't. So it is interesting, again, to watch the antecedents of her first exposure to Paulo Freire and how it forms such a core aspect of her practice. A second theorist who very, very clearly affects Rebecca's work is Louise Moll and notions of funds of knowledge. So she says that kids, and this is how she behaves, this is how she operates, kids have really important things to say about the world. She emphasized always their ideas, not her ideas. She already understands that they bring to school vast and rich experiences, that they are already very, very knowledgeable in multiple ways. It's important to understand, and many people think of funds of knowledge as kind of coming to know students and coming to sort of understand their families and their communities, but it's much more than that. It is really a pathway, according to Rebecca's practice, a pathway into students' very essence. It is a pathway into their hearts. It is a pathway into what they care about. And so she cultivates a community of learners who can share all the sort of experiences and knowledges that they're bringing to bear on the classroom that they share together. So in Moll's words, she knows very clearly that students are not passive bystanders, but very active participants, and that they can only be motivated by learning or to learn if their interests and their questions are actually engaged in the process. In some ways, when we think about good teaching and when we talk about an excellent teacher like Rebecca, it seems so commonsensical, right? Good teaching should engage students. It should connect to what they care about. They are motivated by their passions. You would think that all of us would be able to do this and we'd see this kind of motivating teaching, connected teaching in every classroom. And yet somehow it doesn't happen. So a lot of what I will talk about today and share with you in terms of Rebecca's practice is, and Dr. White-Smith and I were talking about it earlier, it is not magic. It is not a mystery. It's actually very fundamental, even though the results are very magical. One thing that's interesting about Rebecca is that she takes this funds of knowledge idea and extends it. So going beyond simply the individual student and their family, she talks about community funds of knowledge, and not just students' communities, but the wider community around the school. Because her whole thing is, she said, I can't do it myself. I need help to do this. I can't help students do everything that they want to do. I don't know enough to be the person that addresses all their questions. So I have to engage every resource that's around me, no matter what it is. So if you were to visit Rebecca's classroom, I would bet you that within 20 minutes, she would figure out some way in which you could participate with her classroom and help her students, because that is exactly what she does. One example is that the Columbia University Medical Center program is connected to her classroom, and what graduate students from the med school do is they come and tutor her students, as well as students at the school in general, in math and science. And so they receive, obviously, great support around two very tough subjects. At the same time, these graduate students, who are hoping to work in New York City hospitals and clinics, learn about the cultures and languages and the communities and families that they might be working with in New York City. And again, they learn this through intimate relationships, deep connection, and sustained conversation and friendships and relationships with these students. A third theorist, which Rebecca did not talk about, but was actually, at least not in name, but was actually so clear in terms of her work, is Jean Lave's work around learning communities. Jean Lave asks a very basic question. She says, why is learning so problematic in the world? And she says it's problematic because of the alienated condition of contemporary life. That the relationships and connections that we have person to person have become thinner and more dispersed over time. And that the loneliness and isolation that people feel, especially young people, interferes with, of course, their learning. So in Rebecca's classroom, she has some big principles that she posts at the beginning of the year. And this is one of them. And it is all about community and learning and how learning together is learning better. That growing as learners requires that community work. But it is not a rule that she sort of lays down by fiat. She begins each year in conversation with her newcomers about the kind of learning community they want to be in. What makes them feel happy and safe? what kind of community makes them feel supported, what sorts of expectations do they have of one another, as well as of themselves. In building this community, you have to remember you're talking about newcomers, some of whom don't speak English at all. So it's through sort of shared language, all kinds of translation, pictorial representations, etc., that they talk together and create a community that really fights against the alienation that particularly newcomers can feel. This community is seen as a community of passionate knowers. And again, it goes back to Rebecca's idea that these kids feel things, care about things, and have powerful ideas. And so what she wants to help them do is talk about those ideas and bring them out. And finally, in sort of looking at Rebecca's work, this theory of invitational learning or invitational theory became one that I used to sort of explain and analyze her work. And here you see kind of the four basic principles. People are valuable, and they should be seen as valuable and treated accordingly. Education is a collaborative and cooperative activity. Process is also a product, that it's not simply the outcome of the deliverable, but the journey that you take to get there. And that people possess lots of untapped potential. So what she does around curriculum is she co-creates curriculum based on students' interests and what is important to them. And she looks to her students to help her develop the curriculum that they're going to engage with together. So she invites them into the teaching and learning process and sees them as very important and critical partners. So her goal primarily is to make sure that she helps her students open up, trust her and one another. And she said the only way I can do that is to really honor their ideas and their participation. So here are some examples of curriculum invitations, and the words in italics come from Rebecca, and the words in straight text actually are quotes from the students. So in invitational learning, ideas begin with the students. And what students say is that when we share ideas, we get new ideas. Rebecca does not pull punches in terms of expectations for her students. And I remember one very funny video where she was sitting at a desk focusing on something with another student, and a student at the other side of the room was saying something about what he had just completed, and she just said, "You can do better," and then turned back to the student that she was working with. And when she saw the video, she said, "Oh my God, I just sound so horrible." But she didn't. It is sort of emblematic of her insistence on quality work, providing students with all the supports they need to do that, but at the same time, not assuming that they would do anything less than better. This next quote is one of my favorites, where one of the students says, "I just want to eat the English," because he's just so excited about finding words and connecting and being able to say what he wants to say. Prescribed rote curriculum, Rebecca calls it soul crushing. She says, if I had to do that, teaching would be dead for me, and it would be dead for my students, and it never, ever leads to high-level learning. And finally, when you talk about Rebecca's work in the context of racism, a very troubled world, COVID pandemic, there's a poignant story of a young girl from Yemen, new student, whose story was being translated by another student from Yemen, where she was talking about, running from bombs and explosions and, using hand gestures. And then she said, "Here I safe." Unbelievable. But that's what students need. They need safety. And in a racism pandemic, too many students do not feel safe in the places called school where they should. I'm just going to share a few. I'm a little concerned about the time, so I'm just going to run through these pictures very quickly. There's just some pictures of Rebecca's students. They engage in social action projects, and again, they stem from their own interests. It's not as if Rebecca says, okay, now we're going to study climate march, because that's just not how it happens. So here they are designing shirts for the climate march, and then they took part in the climate march. So it is really sort of bringing students into experiences, their whole selves, their whole lives, and their communities to connect to issues that matter to them and that they care about. The other thing that students do is, and here's Rebecca right here in the middle of her students, but in their partnership with Teachers College, Columbia University, the students present their advocacy projects to faculty and graduate students at TC. And so this idea of talking to an authentic and important audience really causes students to revise and revise their work, to look for more resources, to make sure that they are presentably, attired and are standing up straight and using their voices. It really is something quite lovely to see. And finally, actually it's not finally, but one thing that is also part of the experience in Rebecca's class is what's called the New York City Detectives. And this is kind of a Saturday club that is designed and developed by students themselves. And what's happened is that, so Rebecca and the co-director of TRTC helped the students develop this club, and graduates from CHA take current students, and they sort of identify field trips that they'd like to take. And the field trips are not simply to sort of see the sights in New York City, but to connect to what they're learning in their content area classes so that they can actually witness and immerse themselves in the experience relevant to what they're learning in classrooms. But they also say, and I'm going to read this, the students also state the purpose of their club as connecting us to experts, scientists, architects, historians, writers, artists, musicians, etc., who are masters in their crafts and can articulate a sense of beauty in their fields. And this is from the student-created document that explains the New York City Detectives Club. So the last thing I want to talk about, but you know what? I'm looking at the time and it's nearly 10 o'clock. So do you think I should just skip to the end and worry about the video at another time?
My time, I can cut my time short, Lynn.
Okay, are you sure? I'll try and be fast. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Whitesmith. You know, it always happens. I think I have like 5 minutes worth of things to say, and it usually ends up being far too long. My apologies.
We love to hear what you're saying.
It's because I'm excited about this work and about Rebecca. So TRTC has what's called a Citizen Scientist Program, and it has been happening, I think this year was the 4th year, and I'll talk a little bit about how that was different. So what happens is that you have teachers, and in this case, it's multiple levels of people. So here in this picture is a high school student, we have a first-year teacher, and we have 2 student teachers over here. And they spend several weeks developing curriculum around environmental education. And what students at CHA and some of our other partnership schools do is that they engage in citizen scientist projects where they are looking at river health. They work with the Bronx River Society. They collect data. They develop simulations and build models. They think deep ideas. They argue and debate. They talk to policymakers. They look at laws. They do all kinds of amazing things in order to engage in this highly intellectual, experiential curriculum. I do want to show you just a really short video that gives you a little more information about this. And
since 2017, the teaching residence at Teachers College has been working with teachers throughout New York City to design fun and engaging environmental science programs for students throughout the 5 boroughs. For 3 weeks each summer, students would become citizen scientists and investigate the health of the New York City watershed. Students would work together to gather samples, analyze pollution, and accomplish feats of real scientists. Students quickly learned about the larger environmental impacts of their decisions and their community's decisions. Each year, students discovered that their communities are actually small parts of a global community, and they knew that they had the power to make larger global change. These students became global citizens. In 2020, because of COVID-19 and new CDC restrictions, our Citizen Scientist program has transformed into something new and unique. Today, we're excited to welcome you to TRTC's Global Citizens Program. This summer, you will have the chance to explore one or more of the brand new original programs. You will learn about new topics or deepen your understanding on a familiar one. With this newly gained knowledge, you have more agency to move our communities towards a more equal and fair world. Welcome.
But the one thing I wanted to say is that, so for the past 3 years, they've been doing this work during the summer. And as I said, it involves these layers of people engaged in developing curriculum, not just the teachers, but experienced teachers, graduate students, interns from an undergraduate college that is partnering with the program, high school students, and also volunteers. But this year, because of COVID, they obviously were not able to go face-to-face and do actual work out in the field. And so they took the work online and have offered all kinds of really interesting virtual workshops. So let me close with just sort of some basic principles that I think emerge from Rebecca's work and I think are ways in which we can think about teaching and learning and ways in which we can think about teaching teacher preparation. The first is this notion of equitable mindsets. And there are 4 things that occur to me when I look at Rebecca's work. The first I call as if, that she approaches her students as if they are on the brink of greatness. So she expects great things from them. She's there to provide the support to enable them to do that, but she is certain that and behaves as if they will be successful. The second is this notion without question that they are able to do the work, that she understands that her students come with all kinds of areas of weakness as well as strength. Many of them have had interrupted educations. Many of them have been out of school for a while. Many of them come from education systems that are very different from the US. But without question, they have the energy, brain power to learn. And so that is how she treats them and works with them. The third is her focus on capacity building, that wherever students are, that's a beginning point. And from that point, they move forward and upward. And without fail, all of her students do that. And you heard the can do better, you know, high expectations, but high expectations with a lot of love and a lot of support. The second is empowering pedagogies. That what matters to students is what the curriculum should be. That it's not about the text, and it's not about the standardized tests, and it's not about the mandated curriculum. Rebecca understands very clearly that she works within a system. And so what she says is, I keep my eye on what is required, but I also know how to get there through things that matter to students. So for instance, one of the Common Core standards is being able to write persuasive arguments. Students are doing that when they are presenting and researching their social action projects. So they are learning skills through what matters to them. They don't have to learn skills through the materials that are typically provided. The world really is their textbook in a sense. Authentic purposes and audiences. She talks about students coming up during lunchtime, during down periods, all filling up her classroom, revising and drafting and working on their projects and what have you, because they care so much, because they're going to be talking to real people about their work. And in fact, last year's Citizen Scientists project, they actually had policymakers. They invited policymakers to their presentations and talked about their findings about pollution, about water and river health, and about their ideas for sustainability. And that empowering pedagogy is supported by communities that collaborate. The last point is about love. And here there's no doubt that Rebecca is completely in love with all her students in the ways that are meaningful, where she wants to keep them safe, where she thinks of them as valuable, where she respects them and their families and communities, and she believes that they can do great things. But I'm going to borrow from my friend, BZ Fenimore, who recently retired, but she has a website, look her up, she does some great stuff. And she wrote a little pamphlet many, many years ago that said how to treat all kids like rich kids. And her basic premise is that kids who are more advantaged typically are treated more respectfully, more nicely. They're given more breaks. They're given the benefit of the doubt. All those kinds of things. She has 10 points, and I will share only one. And that's the first one, which says, make sure that every day you say hello and goodbye to every student in your classroom. Because there are many students who go through school every single day without being noticed and without anyone speaking to them. So this idea of really valuing all kids is what I definitely see in Rebecca's classroom. All right, thank you, Kimmy. I've used some of your time, but appreciate it.
Okay,